Hello, folks. This is Fantasy Grounds Academy. I am Laren, and I'm going to show you some basic things about Fantasy Grounds Unity and navigating through it. A lot of people seem to be a little bit intimidated, or perhaps they don't know what's happening, or maybe they're unsure of where things are. So I'm going to go through some of that with you, and hopefully this will help you out. By no means is this a complete, thorough research thing. This is something I'm doing for the community, just for the sake of ease and to help people get started. So one of the things that people have trouble with is the font and some of the sizing and where the windows are and that sort of thing. So I want to take you through something that's very important in the beginning of Fantasy Grounds. So once you've downloaded the client, and if you have a license, you've added your license key. So if you go into settings, you can basically bring up your license key. And in there, you will see the license key area. Use your username and your password for the Fantasy Grounds website. That is how you log in to Fantasy Grounds. Once you do that, then you'll have access to the store and all those sort of things. One thing you got to know up here is Fantasy Grounds Unity Application UI Scale. You need to play around with this number until you get a comfortable view of Fantasy Grounds. So what this does is it scales the size of Fantasy Grounds, but it may or may not be what you need. Some of us that have glasses, if you scale this down beyond 80%, it's going to be very hard to read the text. If you go over 100%, you will not have much room for all your different data types. So there's a balance between what's too small and what's too big. So I have mine set at 85 or 80. That's roughly where I usually set it. If you have a laptop or a small screen that's less than 19 inches, I wouldn't go any smaller or tinier than 90%. If you do that, it's going to be way too small. If you have a huge monitor or a TV, you probably don't want to go any lower than 75%. And what will happen is it'll shrink everything. You'll have a ton of room, but you won't be able to see anything. So there's a balance between what you're going to set this to and what your eyes and your table needs. So that's an important piece of this navigation, is to have the room, but also the visibility of Fantasy Grounds once you're in it. So once you've changed that, it'll save and be universal. You can also do this inside of a campaign. There is a command like /scale/UI, put a space, and then put the percentage and hit enter. But that only saves it for that session. If you change it back here in the actual settings, it will help you and it will keep it the same throughout. Once you've made your changes, you've added your license key, your username for the Fantasy Grounds website, and your password, then you hit save. And it brings Fantasy Grounds back to a launcher updater. And then you just click on either update, depending on what you're doing. Like if you just purchased a bunch of new content, you want to update. If you're just going to go back to the launcher, you click on Launch Fantasy Grounds. So once the screen comes up, first thing you're going to want to do is consider creating a campaign. Now, there are sometimes starter campaigns with some of the rule sets, and here I have a whole bunch of campaigns that I've already made. I actually have to go through and manage some of these because it's getting a little bit ridiculous. Some of these I don't even use anymore. But you want to click on Create Campaign, and then you're going to give your campaign a name. So if you're going to do a D&D 5e game, just type D&D 5e. And the reason you're going to do that is when you have a whole bunch of campaign folders, you're not going to know which ones were D&D, which ones were Pathfinder. So create your own system of filing and in your names for your campaigns, because when you go to the back-end view to look at your campaigns, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the folder, which is on the top left corner of Fantasy Grounds. So I open that up. This is the back end of Fantasy Grounds. You have a tokens area, portraits, modules, extensions, and campaigns. The other data types, you don't usually have to mess with those too much, but if you want to add anything custom, you put them in tokens, you put them in portraits, or if you have maps or assets, you put them in the images area. Also, if you have a campaign that you've created, it'll be stored in the subfolder called campaigns. So if you open this up, this is where all of your made campaigns are. This is where you manage them. And if you don't name them accordingly, like a lot of these I have not, you won't know which one is which. So be careful what you call your campaigns. So if you need to delete the folder or modify it or something, you'll know what rule set it's in, especially if you own more than one rule set. That helps a lot. So once you're within one of these folders and the subfolder, then if you go into the campaign folder, you are going to find images, tokens. Sometimes you'll find portraits. These are unique and they are only accessible in this campaign. So if I load up this DM103 class, anything in this images folder or any of the other subfolders are only going to be accessible from within the campaign. If you want something to be accessible for all campaigns, such as a map that you're going to use all the time, then you want to put it at the Fantasy Grounds level, not the campaign level. And what that'll do is you have your images, your portraits, and your tokens, and they'll be accessible in the data folder when you load up Fantasy Grounds, and you don't necessarily have to be in any specific campaign. So that's part of the navigation, is an understanding where that stuff is. So this is the back end of Fantasy Grounds. You really don't want to mess around too much in here, but if you have to, this is where it is. And if you have extensions, you'd put them in there. If you have modules, like third-party ones, you would also put those in your modules folder, like stuff from the DM's Guild, or when you create a module, that's where it saves by default, unless you change the directory. All of these little screenshots down here are when you hit the print screen button when you're in Fantasy Grounds, it'll save a screenshot, and that's where they're stored. Then you have some other things in here that I don't mess with too much, but you have a cache folder. You have a vault, and the vault is where the official content is stored. It looks like I have 9 gigs worth of vault information. That's crazy. The vault is compressed, and it is locked, and it is copyright protected, so you can't open anything in the vault. Whereas the modules folder will contain any and all modules that you've created or that you've downloaded from the DM's Guild or whatever. So these are where you would store third-party stuff. So third-party content is a little different than the official content that you get from Fantasy Grounds and Smiteworks. That's a DAT file. It's basically the same type of thing, except for it is compressed and it also has some safety and features on it. So that's to protect the intellectual property. So when you're in Fantasy Grounds, you go to Roaming, Smiteworks, Fantasy Grounds. Now, if you've changed your data directory, you're going to have to keep track of that because that can be very confusing. I personally would not change it unless you absolutely have to. Some people have a smaller solid state drive and they don't want to store all their data on it. I get that, but just be careful where you store these because it can kind of confuse installations and it can cause confusion when you're upgrading and stuff. So just be careful of that. So once you get an understanding of where things are in the back end, then when you create a campaign and you're going into it and you actually are accessing images and assets, it won't be such a mystery. So I'm going to do a D&D campaign and I'm going to select the rule set. And then you have options to load up these extensions or decals or features that you may or may not have depending on what you've subscribed to. But I have a font here that I'm going to load into this campaign. So you have to do this before, not during when you have it up. So I'm going to click on this Roboto one, which is there's 2. One's for Classic and one's for Unity. So I want to make sure I got the Unity one. The Roboto one makes the text a little bit larger. Not much, but just a little. This was created by Modifiers, one of our former fellow Fantasy Grounds Academy teachers, who's a very good DM. He creates content on the DM's Guild, and he'll contribute and he'll come over and help. But right now, the more content you load, the more memory it's going to take. So try not to load 50,000 extensions, especially if they do similar things, because you're going to find that it'll break your campaign, or they may not be up to date. So you got to be careful with that. So don't load too many extensions. Do a little research on them before you add them to your campaign. Maybe make a test campaign and check it out before you include it in your game. That way it doesn't break anything. And usually it breaks because Fantasy Grounds update, something changes, then the author has to go back and fix it. So That's a risk that everyone takes when they use extensions. Some extensions don't do anything except for change the way Fantasy Grounds looks. Most of those are usually safe unless they change the UI, which is coming up, by the way. They're going to do some really nice UI changes. It's in the test server. But for right now, if you don't need a password, you don't have to put it there. If you want to change your default name instead of GM, whatever your name is, in my case it's Laren, I can put Dungeon Master instead, so it doesn't give my username out. And then I would set this to LAN, which is just your local area network. It's private. You're not connected to the cloud when you are working on your campaign. You don't need to do that. Only when you're sharing your table. So if you click cloud, you can do a private or you can do a public, depending on what you need to do as far as running your game. But as far as setting up and navigating through Fantasy Grounds, you just need the LAN. So once you have that set, you're going to hit start. So we already selected our rule set. We gave it a title, so I'm going to call it D&D 5e Navigation, because that's what this topic is about. So we're going to do some Fantasy Grounds navigation. So now I'm going to hit start. And once that happens, you're going to be waiting for a minute for it to load. The more content you have in the background, like tokens and modules and stuff, it adds a little bit of load time to Fantasy Grounds. So one of the things, if you want to bypass a lot of this load time, you want to try to manage your content and not have whopping collections like I do. I've got like 6 gigs worth of modules. I have 9 gigs worth of official content. And God knows how much tokens and stuff I have. So that's kind of a no-no. It's not a good practice. So that is something that I am faulted for, and I know it's not right. So if you guys know any better and you want things to go smoother and you don't want a lot of this load time and lag, then try not to overload the application. That's kind of the bottom line with Fantasy Grounds is less is more. The less you can get away with, the better off you're going to be, the less lag, the less sharing issues you're going to have with your table, and it's going to be easier to manage. When you start adding all these extensions and content, that's when things start getting kind of out of hand. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's more of a tip. You don't have to do it. You can do whatever you want. It's just something that I've learned over the last few years of using Fantasy Grounds. And this was true of Classic and Unity. So even though Unity is a modern platform and it can handle more larger files, your internet and your bandwidth cannot. So if you're sharing this with your players across the network, your upload speed will be taxed. And that's what really matters as the host, is your upload speed. So when you're sharing content, you don't want to have 20 modules and all kinds of stuff. So here we are at the basic interface. So this pop-up window is a campaign setup. It's kind of a handy little shortcut. It kind of gives you a starting point. Everything on here is default. I haven't changed anything yet. But this is the basic screen that you're going to get when you first start Fantasy Grounds. These little links here will link you to official forums. There's the manual, and there's some wiki user guides, like if you want coding and that sort of thing, or if you want to know some of the syntax. Once you've got to this point, you hit Next, and you're given the option to load modules or campaign books or anything that you have for your rule set. If you don't own anything yet, you can click on the SRD, which is the System Reference Documents. Those come free with the 5e rule set. Once you have a license of some sort and you update Fantasy Grounds, it'll pull that stuff in and you'll be able to access it. So this is the really raw, basic material that comes with Fantasy Grounds before you even buy any content. And then you also get the basic rules, which is a very pared down version of the Player's Handbook and the DM's Guide. So the SRD is kind of like the skeleton, and then the basic rules kind of gives you just enough to try Fantasy Grounds out without buying anything. So I think you can build like a Dwarven Cleric all the way through, whereas the SRD is very generic. You're kind of limited on options. So it just depends on what your needs are. If you're going to create content for Fantasy Grounds and you want it to be completely unique and custom and like a homebrew world, you need to base everything off the SRD. If you're just going to build stuff for the DM's Guild, you can use pretty much most of the D&D 5e content, minus artwork and maps and stuff. But you can use the text, you can use names, places, references, and even content if you want to link it. So that is basically the very basics there. If you want to load the basic rules, you can. That gives you a few more options for building stuff, but it really is very pared down. So don't expect a lot out of this very beginning stages. It is basically almost critical to have at least a player's handbook. If you have that book alone, you'll basically be able to do what you want. It's the base core rule set. You don't even need the monster manual or the DM's guide if you just want to invest in the player's handbook. And then all the other stuff you can actually input yourself. And once you have an example of how that's done and you get familiar with Fantasy Grounds, that sort of thing becomes more and more of something you might seek out in the future. So now that I have this loaded, I'm going to unclick Show on Load, because when I come back, I do not want to see this again. The next thing is I'm going to hit Next, and I'll close this because that's already confirmed that we've loaded. And this takes you to the options. So when you go up, click on Options, it takes you to the Options section in the interface. The options can also be accessed up here in the right-hand corner. It's a little gear cog. So I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. And once I do that, if I sign back off and come back into Fantasy Grounds, that little pop-up window won't come up anymore. But if you need it to come up, you can click Setup in the Options area, and that will let you re-access that. And then you can even turn back on the Show on Load if you want it to pop up every time. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, but it forms a circle. So if you close this and you're in Options, you can click Setup and you can go through and it'll take you back to Options. So it's kind of a circle how it works. So there are a lot of options in Fantasy Grounds. I'm not going to cover those, but they are in the Options section. They are different per rule set. Some have this stuff, some doesn't. It just depends on what you're getting into, what you're doing. But one thing I notice that people like to do is to change this decal or get rid of it. So there's a thing called Desktop Decal Image. So right now it has the SmiteWorks default logo. You want to change that, you can just click Custom and it'll go away, or you can turn it off. Custom would imply that you have content already in Fantasy Grounds and you want to make your own background. So if I go to Assets, assuming that I've already put them in the Assets folder, you can come over to Assets, and I have this particular graphic that I use for Fantasy Grounds Academy. It's in the Data folder. So if I double-click the Data folder and the Images folder, because that's where it's stored, I have a folder called Fantasy Grounds College Logos, but it's actually FGA now. It used to be College. So that I can double click on any image and get a preview. And this is what the image looks like. I can decide if I want to set it as a background decal, or I can add it to the images. But in this case, I'll do a background decal. So I'm going to click that, and there it is. So that is how you customize your tabletops. You can make it decorative or artistic. You could also make a graphic that's helpful for your players. Maybe it's a graphic that shows what they can and can't do during a turn. So if you're teaching them the rule set, maybe you'll have a reference sheet that you would put back here so the players will always have visibility of it. This depends on how you want to use your given rule set and how you use Fantasy Grounds. So that's just one of the settings in the options area. But down at the bottom is something important that you're going to want to know about, and that is how do you change this data on the right-hand side. This is going to change soon, but for the time being, if you click on Sidebar, that is going to give you a pop-up window, and it's going to allow you to customize what you view here. By default, you are in Game Master mode. If you are a player and you're connected to someone else's table, you will see the play mode, which is a lot less because you don't really need all the buttons. If you're going to level up or create PC, there is the create PC preset. And then if you want to explore everything, like let's say you got some new content or you're making something, click on all, and that gives you all the different banners. So you can also customize this. You can clear it, and you can add the ones that you want. So it's really up to you, but that's how you customize it. I took a peek at the test preview. They're changing the way the buttons work, so by the time you watch this video, it may have been updated already. I apologize for that. There's not much I can do about it. This constantly evolving rule sets and platforms, so if you guys are watching this in the future and these aren't the same, it's probably because Fantasy Grounds has done a major user interface update. So just kind of letting you know that as a little basically a disclaimer. Okay, so I'll close the sidebar and I'm going to close the options, but I didn't leave anything in the sidebar. So I want to go back and click on all because I want to see all of the data types. Then I'll go ahead and click that and get rid of it. And then I'm going to click and close the options. So one thing about Fantasy Grounds is the view is customizable per user. So if I set my table up a certain way, it does not set up the table for the players that way. They have to do their own setting. So I'm going to go through some of that, and it's very important. And a lot of people give me crap about it, but it is something that is very fundamental to Fantasy Grounds, and it's something you really want to learn and start understanding. And once that clicks, Fantasy Grounds is a lot easier to use. So I'm going to go to the library. And right now, as you can see, I just have the core rules. So I'm going to load up a module just so we have some reference. So I'm going to go to modules. And if you have any content, third party or purchased, it will show up here. Down on the bottom left, there's a search field. So I'm going to load up Lost Mine just so I have some content. And so I can show you where it is. So if you own Lost Mine of Phandelver and you've updated Fantasy Grounds, it will show up in your library. But since I have so much content, I've got 95 pages worth of stuff. So I'm going to search for Lost Mine, and it brings up a few things with that title in it. So I'm going to go ahead and load the Lost Mine of Phandelver module. And you can see I have some third-party content from Grim Press that shows Lost Mine of Phandelver loot, which gives you loot options for all the different creature types. And then there's a automatic effects module that helps with some of the automation for the module itself. I'm not going to get into these, but these are third-party content. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now that I have that loaded, it shows up in my library. So one of the things you'll want to know is once you have rulebooks and official content, usually there'll be a reference manual for all the different official books. Not everything has a reference manual, especially if it is a third-party book or a tool. Some people don't know how to make a reference manual. There are ways to do it, but I'm not going to cover that. So I'm going to go to reference manual, and what this is a digital representation of your content. So if you own Lost Mine of Phandelver, the hardback book, and you have the Fantasy Grounds version, that's basically what you're getting is a copy or an actual, like a viewable book through Fantasy Grounds. So if you want to run Fantasy Grounds and just use it as like your library and for organizing things, it works very well for that. You can also play offline, so you don't have to be connected to the internet. If you're going to do face-to-face games, you can put it on a platform and still have access to your library and not be shut out because you don't have internet access. And that's one of the cool things I like about Fantasy Grounds. I don't like being separated from that just because I don't have internet. Another cool thing about it is that, if you're playing around at your home and you got the access, you can put it up on a large screen and use a different account and connect to it, and that would be like your player's side, and they can see what's going on there. So there's a way to run Fantasy Grounds online, and there's also a way to do it hybrid, and then you can also run it just like you would a regular tabletop. So it really depends on your usages. But one of the features I love about Fantasy Grounds, and I'm going to close the library for right now, is the fact that not only can you read through, and you got these arrows down at the bottom to navigate through the books, but on the bottom left, you can search. So if I wanted to search for goblin, probably not a good idea because there's a lot of goblins in here. But I can hit enter and it'll bring up anything that has to do with goblins. So let's say we wanted to look at the this goblin blind here. We can bring that up. It has the text. It has the encounter. It has stuff to do with the rules. So there's a rule book thing if you have the library for it. So if you have the rule books loaded, it will link to that module. So if you have like the D&D, like the Player's Handbook or the Monster Manual, it'll bring that up. The other thing is when you're going through this, not only do you have the search and such, but up here on top next to this reference tag is a link, and these are shortcuts that open up different pieces of Fantasy Grounds. And you can see I'm getting errors on the left-hand side because I don't have the actual modules loaded. So if you click on this Goblin Blind, which is this page, it's a link to the page. This is the same page but broken out of the reference manual. So if I close the reference manual on accident, or I don't want it anymore, and I just want this Goblin Blind section, I can drag and drop it down to the hotkeys. And then if you accidentally close it, or you want to bring it up later, you can click on the shortcut, or you can assign it to one of your shortcut keys, and it'll bring it up. Very handy and powerful tool. It sounds simple, but it's actually very useful. The other thing that Fantasy Grounds offers is your ability to change the way the windows are sized and how things fit on your screen. And this is a big thing. So without messing around too much, I'm going to size the windows the way I want them when I'm going to run the game, or even when I'm playing. So one of the things that people fight with is they'll bring up something like this, and then they'll move it because it's in the way of something else. Then they'll open up another thing, and they'll have to move it again. That is what makes Fantasy Grounds very frustrating if you don't understand how it works. So my advice to you is to go through your content, find out what you want open during your sessions. So you would get your content ready to run for your game. So a lot of that comes down to organization and understanding Fantasy Grounds. So if I wanted this to come up here, and when I close this, I want it to come back to the same place. I don't want it to pop up where I left it. I want it to pop up where I put it. Same thing with this area over here where the chat window is. So if you right click on it, you can actually unlock it, and you can manipulate the size of it from the bottom right corner. And that will give you the ability to change how tall it is, how wide it is. And like I said, this doesn't change the players. This is only for yours. They have to do their own. So this is where I would set this usually when I'm playing. And then up on top is where the players, when they connect, they will be in the campaign. So I have a graphic here that actually shows this layout. So I'm going to post this out in social media. I've already done so if you guys see this, but basically it's a key. It tells you what's what and what's been what's been being utilized and where things are and where their layout is. So I'm going to do that now in Fantasy Grounds. So I have my story entry here. I have the chat window, which doesn't really need to be that tall vertically. I mean, it only needs to be viewable up to a certain point. And then I'm going to grab the combat tracker, which is in the top right corner. And I'm going to grab this and leave a little room on top for my players when they connect. And what this does is it organizes it so that I have the room to place combatants and NPCs, but then I also have this viewable space below. If you have too many combatants on this combat tracker, you're going to be scrolling up and down, and that's going to drive you nuts. So one of the things you want to do eventually is learn how to scale your encounters into smaller bites instead of a huge whopping battle. Sometimes you can't help that, but if you can and you understand what you're doing, you can take apart encounters and reassemble them, make them in smaller waves instead of one big whopping battle. So the other thing is your map. So once you have your text that you want to read and have access to, on the very bottom you can hit these arrows and that'll bring you to the next page. So you can navigate through here without having to actually move anything. And that's important that you understand that. If they're numbered correctly and they're in the right groups, these arrows will navigate you through the content. The other thing is the images and maps. So if you're going to run this actual encounter, this is the Goblin Blind and Lost Mine, I'm going to pull up images, and what you'll find is a hodgepodge of random images from all different sources. So I want to use the drop down in the group area, and I'm going to look for Lost Mine of Phandelver maps. So here are the monsters, here's the maps. Once I have that narrowed down to this group, then I can get a better view without getting confused. So I want to pull out the Kragma Hideout because that's where this blind is. And I'm going to use the player map. So Kragma Hideout player. So at first, when you first bring that up, it's not really going to be in the right location or the right place for where you want it. So what I'm going to do is size the window accordingly. So I want it to pop up over here above this content, but in this area, so I have access to it. And I want to move it to where it's going to be easily seen and accessible, and it doesn't cover everything. So this is where I would have it, right here. And if you need it a little bigger, a little smaller, that's fine. And then you would click anywhere on the map, and you can scroll in and out to zoom in. And if you unlock the map, you can do a lot more to it. You can look at the line of sight. You can adjust things. You can add line of sight, whatever you need to do. Most of the official product already has it built in. But you can make adjustments, add assets, change things around, whatever you need to do for your campaign. You can also add custom content if that's what you're into. So what I'm going to do right now is, see, this says Kragma Hideout Player. And up on top, I'm going to type, I'm going to say Cavern. Because that's all of it. They don't need to know it's the Goblin Hideout. So if I right-click and I share this with my table, so that's how you share, is you right-click on a map and you click Share Record. That's going to share this particular image, but it's going to say Kragma Hideout Player. I don't want that. I want to just say Cavern, and then when I share this, it will only show this cell, not the main one, because this is more of the DM's information. And then as far as that goes, I'll just go ahead and lock it, and then you can zoom in and zoom out. This is the Goblin Blind that we're on right now. And when you have text like this, whenever you see this, you want to size the window as needed. So that little shortcut cannot be seen by your players, but as the game master, you can access that. So you can access it from this view here, and this is the text that you're going to use to run this encounter. And I have it right down here at the bottom. I'm going to resize the window, and then I'm going to have my text right here. And the reason I'm doing this is so that you're not moving everything around. And then when you need to navigate through this, you can use the arrows. And it's linked to the map in most cases. And then if you need to recenter the map, like if it gets all the way over here or something happens, make sure you leave the frame. So leave this alone once you have it sized, the actual frame. And then just zoom in and out on the map, and you can right-click and click on View, and you can do Zoom to Fill or Zoom to Fit. So if you do Zoom to Fill, it takes it to the extremes. So that is basically how you recenter the map. The other thing that people fight with is they may want to use this space under here. So if that's the case, just close the map. Don't move it. And that's usually what happens. So you can shortcut it down at the bottom. Along with your text here, you can also shortcut that. Once you come back to Fantasy Grounds and you restart, everything's going to look like this. You're not going to have nothing will really be loaded. So what you'll do is you'll click on the combat tracker to bring that up, and then your shortcuts down here will put the windows back where you put them. So that way you're not fighting, you're not looking for them, you have it organized down in your hotkeys. And there are several hotkey combinations. You got Control, Alt, those sort of things. So there's a ton of Shift, Alt, Tab. I mean, there's a ton. There's like 96, I think, different shortcuts. So that's something that most people fight with, is they keep moving stuff around. Leave the windows where they're at. That's really the key. Once you have that down and you understand it, it makes running this so much easier. The next step is, let's go ahead and bring up an encounter. So here's the Goblin Blind. So if I bring that up, here is the actual text, and there's the encounter is linked here, and they're already placed on the map. So this little check mark means that they're placed. So this may be a little different in other rule sets, but this is how this one works. So this would be a temporary thing, so I'd hit the down arrow, and what that does is it adds the combatants to the combat tracker, and it shows where they are on the map, but they are not visible. So they're just there ready to go. Then when you add players, so if I go to characters, here's another thing that you'll have to learn how to manage your characters. So right now I don't have any characters made. I don't have the time to build one, but I'm going to import one from another campaign that I've already built. So if I click this little import button, it's going to search through Fantasy Grounds for all of my characters and all the different campaigns for the 5e rule set. It shouldn't be bringing up Pathfinder and Call of Cthulhu. It should be bringing up whatever rule set you're in. So you don't have to worry about that. But it will bring up any and all Fantasy Grounds characters that you've used in Fantasy Grounds, provided that you already have some other campaigns going. So I don't want to sit here and take the time to build a character, but I'm going to go ahead and import one. So here's a level 3 character here. So if I click this little plus button, what it does is it adds it to this campaign. So once I hit the back arrow to character selection, now it is available. So when players connect to my table, they can select this character. One thing you got to know about Fantasy Grounds is there's no way to preview a character as a player before you select it. So you'll have to select the character. Once you have it selected, it's going to say that you own it. So I'm going to take ownership as the game master. And what that does is it takes it out of the pool of available characters to use. So if you want to reserve a character, that's the way to do it. Once you're done with it, you can right-click and release it. So maybe you don't want to reserve it anymore. And the player characters can do that as well. When they join a new table and they're trying to pick a character, they will select it, read about it, and then you right-click on your portrait, and then you release the character. So it goes back into the pool. So there's not a good way to preview characters when you're loading them in Fantasy Grounds. The only way is to take possession and to read about it. So that is basically where your characters are. Once you have your characters, I'm going to add that to the combat tracker. And then you have a party sheet where you can manage your entire party. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to that too. This is your overview of the party, and this is your combat and rounds and turns and such. So once I've done that, I'll close this. I'm going to close that. And one of the key things about using Fantasy Grounds is the placement of your window. So both of these goblins are going to be part of this campaign and this encounter. So I'm going to bring up the NPC stat block and stretch it out to where I can read everything and it's in one place. And I'm going to do the same thing with the next goblin. I'm going to take this one, place it, and have it ready for my encounter. And now my player character, same thing. I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to put it in a place where I can access it, where it's not covering a lot of other things. And it's only covering the other NPCs because I have it set up that way as a deck of cards, basically. And then when I want to access my Actions tab, which is where most of your rolling and work will be done, you go to the Actions tab, and then you would click it on the Combat mode and Actions. And that will take you into whatever mode you need. Right now, this character is not fully built. He doesn't have all his equipment, so that's why nothing's showing up. We haven't picked any spells either. But nonetheless, there's the spell slots. If you had any weapons, they'd be up here. You can also add custom effects, that sort of thing. So this is where you're going to be most of the time when you're a player. The other handy thing about it is if you're a player and you're still learning Fantasy Grounds, you want to take like your initiative roll and you can place that in the hotkeys. So when your DM or Game Master says, hey, I want you to roll initiative, you can just single click and it will roll. And it will record it, and it will automatically put you in that particular order. The other thing is you'll be in your Actions tab, so it's nice to have a couple shortcuts. So one of the other shortcuts I would recommend as a player is also probably to have Perception, because I know that's used a lot. So you take the dice roll itself, not the description, but the actual dice. Drag that down to your shortcut, so that's your Perception, proficiency, and in this case, maybe stealth, depending on what your character is. So those are some commonly used skills, and that's basically what I have for most of my shortcuts. And then there's a little down arrow in the combat tracker that allows you to advance the turns and the rounds. You can actually shortcut that little button too. So when your turn's over, instead of reaching over here, everything's down underneath your character sheet. You can click on that and it will advance your turn. So that's a handy little tip for players. So just getting used to the interface, using the shortcuts and laying out the table a certain way every time really adds value to what you're doing. And it makes things so much simpler. Instead of moving stuff around, because what will happen is someone will go, oh, I want this space back here. They'll move the map. They'll close it because it's in the way. And guess where it comes back up? So if I bring that map, it's going to be where I left it. So leave the windows where you want them, and when you want to close them, just X out of them. And if you need to retrieve them quickly, you can make a shortcut bar down below where you can shortcut the little pin, or you can take some notes and you can make a run list, so you can create a new note and you can actually drag these into the note as needed and make this like your run list. So maybe you just want all this stuff in one spot and you don't want 50 shortcuts. You just want this note. That will help. So maybe this is session 1. And that's just, your run list basically. So that's a really handy tip. So there's the Goblin Blind, there's the map, and then there is the, there's the story entry too this is from the reference manual. So it just depends on what your needs are. But once you have those placed, it's so much easier to access them than trying to move things around and open up all these banners and such. So just so you know that you can lay these out ahead of time, make yourself some sort of template that you always use, kind of, just get it set up in the very beginning. Then you don't have to move around. And then in between sessions, you can make changes. So to bring up a character sheet or an NPC, let's say I want this goblin. All I have to do is click on the shortcut on the right-hand side. That brings a sheet up. So every time a new combatant comes up, so let's go back to the player, I just click on this little link. It brings up the player character sheet. If the next turn comes up and it's the goblin's turn, I'll just click on this. It brings up his NPC stat block. So it's much easier doing that than having 12 sheets spread out on your table. So that's just a useful thing. One other thing is people like using the colored dice. So if you go over to the interface on the top right, there's a color palette. You can change the color of your dice by clicking on this color circle. You can click around for whatever color you want. You can slide it. You can adjust it. You can copy and paste an RGB value. Like let's say you have a specific color you want. Or you can use the eyedropper and hover it around the map and use a theme color for this interface. So maybe I want to use the blue that comes off this, or maybe the yellow. So let's do that. So I'm going to take this yellow, and now this dice are yellow, but it's kind of hard to see the text, so you can change it to black. So now I have this black and yellow dice. So you can do that with Fantasy Grounds, kind of make things kind of themed for you. There are a bunch of right-click options in Fantasy Grounds that a lot of people don't know about. So, for instance, in the map area, if you right-click on a map, there is a large radial menu. So you have drawing mode, you have a layer mode, you have view, minimize, close the window, pointers, sharing, and locking and unlocking tokens. When you're in a character sheet, kind of the same thing. If you go to the character sheet, bring that up, and you go to the Actions tab. When you right click on a sheet, you can rest, you can export the character, and you can close the window, or you can minimize. So there's a lot of options when you right click. Same thing with the most of the things in Fantasy Grounds have a right click option. So when you click like this, I can clear the map. So depending on where you are in the data, so even on a story entry, if I unlock this and I right click, I get paragraph options, I get sharing options, I can close the window, I can minimize it. So there's all kinds of right click menus that you need to get used to. So get used to right clicking, because that's a huge function in Fantasy Grounds. I think in almost in every data type there's some sort of right-click menu, like delete and create item is pretty common. So it really depends on what data field that you're in. But that is basically some of the navigation problems that people have with Fantasy Grounds. And it's very important that you get used to that aspect. And once you do, it gets so much simpler. It's not that hard. It's really just a matter of putting your time in and getting used to the interface. There's a couple other things I want to cover just so you can understand how the data works in Fantasy Grounds. So I'm going to close all these NPCs and such, but if I wanted to bring them back up, since I've already located them, I just click on the link and it will bring them back up into place. So I don't even have to mess around with re-dragging them over. The only time that may happen is if you accidentally close out of Fantasy Grounds and it doesn't close properly, you might lose some of your settings, but other than that, you can just re-drag them to the location you want and then close them. That way, you have the room and you won't have to fight it. So I'm going to close everything out here, and I'm going to go over some of the data types so that you understand how this stuff is linked together. So in your library, if you open up an official book, such as The Lost Mine, you will notice these sections or groups. You have pre-gen characters, which is kind of unique. You don't normally get pre-gens. Only the starter set, the Lost Mine of Fandelver, the D&D Essentials, and the special Stranger Things box set have pre-gens. Most other modules do not. They pretty much assume you're going to make your own. So you could add these to a campaign if you wanted. So if you click on these little plus buttons, it will add them to the characters area. So if I bring this up and I just click on these little green buttons, it will add them to the campaign. And this makes it easier so you don't have to spend 4 hours building a character. You can just use the ones that come with the module. That's kind of why they've done this. The pre-gen thing can also be, they can be accessed through importing the character. So if you have the module loaded and you click import character, those characters will also be available there. But that's one way you can add them, is through that. So you have an encounters group that will come up that are part of this, part of the book itself, and it's organized in a nice kind of tidy manner. What you'll notice though is these, you can't edit them, you can only read them. They're pretty much read only. They're part of the reference manual and they're linked in there. They're kind of embedded, but the same data is accessible on the right hand side over here. So what you have is your images and maps and your story, those sort of things. So if I bring up the story items, that is your probably the heart of everything. And then you have your images and maps, which is your visual component. And as you can see, I have this picture right here that I shared earlier, which was this Kragma hideout map. It is shared, so to unshare it, I would just click on that little letter P, or you can right-click on it and unshare the record, that sort of thing. So these are what I'm saying about the right-click options in Fantasy Grounds. There's a ton of them. So get used to right-clicking on things, and you'll find where things are at. And that's basically what Digital Dave did, is he went and just kind of went through everything and right-clicked on everything. So that's how you're going to learn the interfaces, just by clicking around and looking through stuff. So there's the images, the story. I'm going to bring up the NPCs, which are your monsters, non-playing characters, traps, boats, ships, vehicles, hazards, anything like that that does damage or can take damage, basically, is an NPC. And then you have encounters, which is a unique way for Fantasy Grounds to allow you to organize encounters so that it's easier to reward in the party sheet area. So NPCs basically make encounters. And then you have items. So that is all your treasure, not coins, but like gems and stuff, but it's also armor, weapons, equipment, potions, all kinds of stuff. And then you have parcels, which is basically a collection of coins and treasure, and it's an easy way for you to distribute those in the party sheet. So these two sections are very similar in Fantasy Grounds. When you complete a quest, you're able to drag and drop these into the party sheet, which I'll bring that up since I'm talking about it. And you go to the XP area, and when you're done with a certain section, you can drag the encounter over here into the encounters area, and your story items would be based off of a quest item. So if you bring up your quest, this would be like a milestone or something like that. So if you capture somebody or save the princess, that's where those data types are. And then for your inventory, that's where parcels go. So when you have treasure, you can drag and drop those into this area, or you can bring up the parcel itself and drag that over, and that will bring up your content that's in the parcel. And this is just an easy way to distribute content. So you'd hit this side arrow, and that would convert anything for sale. And then when you hit the down arrow, after, I'm going to hit refresh, so I have the party stuff first. And then I'm going to hit the down arrow, and that's going to distribute the coins and any items that the characters chose. You can assign those here if you want. And then for the XP, you can award for encounters, and you can award for quest items, which is your milestones and goals and such. So that's basically most of the data types. And here the chat window shows what was awarded, and it was added automatically to the sheet. So if I go to his inventory, he got some treasure or some loot or some coins. And if I go to his main tab, and I look at his experience points, anything that was awarded was added to a sheet. So he got 1,300. So that's basically a very convenient way to do this. And then you have tables. So we're going to bring up tables. So these are your data types. So what you want to do is get used to filtering to the groups that you need. So we're running Lost Mine Offend Delver. Let's drop down the group. And we're going to go with Lost Mine NPCs. Those are what's in the module. And it's not going to show 50,000 books at once. And then the encounters, I'm just going to worry about part 1 because that's the part we're running. Same thing with quests. I'm just going to go to Lost Mine Offend Delver. So every data type can have a section. Doesn't mean they will, but most of them do. If it's a good campaign and has a lot of content, it'll have a lot of these. So the story entry here is part 1. It has all the chapters in it. I've already selected on the maps here. And then for items, you have mundane and magic items. So I'm just going to go to the regular items. So D&D Lost Mine Offend Delver, and here's all the basic stuff that's not magical. And then Parcels, same thing. So this is how the information is organized. It's very equivalent to going to the reference manual and clicking on these buttons here, because you have equipment, you have tables, you have quests, those sort of things, but you can only read those. Those are read only. The actual data is in these data parcels on the right, where all these bars are over here. So that's how these are interconnected. They're linked together, so everything has a link to the story entry or to the map. So generally NPCs and encounters go together. I would say that images, maps, and stories are a big set here. Items and parcels go together, and then your quests and your tables are kind of miscellaneous. So those are your main data types. Once you understand that, then you can organize your campaign even more. So like I was telling you, I had those story entries and all that stuff out, but if you just want to focus on one chapter, I can bring up that note list that I had earlier, which was for session 1, and I can link the first chapter right to this note list and just use this to run everything. I don't need to have everything open like I do right now. I'm only dragging over the stuff I want to deal with. And then, honestly, when I'm running, I don't have all these open. It's just showing you how the information is connected. So that is basically most of the data types. And then you have this note list here that you can bookmark. So if I take session 1 and bookmark it down here, now I have my own little run list. So when I come to Fantasy Grounds and I'm ready to start playing, all I have to do is open up my run list, which is the notes. I can open up the combat tracker, or I can even link the combat tracker to my run list. So maybe you would put that in the first position, and then maybe you want to have your maps and images come up, so that's already on here. So you can really customize this and make it organized. So when you come back to the table, all you're doing is clicking on links. So 1, 2, 3, and then this story entry is going to be off because it wasn't placed. So I'm going to place this. So that's the key, is placing these windows. Another thing is if you access this through the actual window and you use the arrow keys, you don't have to worry about resizing every window. So that's something you want to keep in mind. But here's the combat tracker. I can bring that up. And then if I want to get really fancy, I could even link the players and the NPCs. So I can link this player. I got to unlock it first. So I can link this player. He doesn't have a name, that's why it did that. But I can also link the goblins here if I wanted to. So you can really create yourself a little run list, and it's going to be real simple for you to run this once you understand that. So this, you could click on all these and bring up whatever data type you need, and then use the shortcuts below. And get used to the right click. So you can right click on a lot of different things and you'll get a lot of different options. And don't forget, up here you have your combat tracker, your party sheet, which keeps track of your overview. It's a tool. There's an optional calendar that you can load. So right now I don't have the calendar loaded, but if I go to modules there is a free module that comes with Fantasy Grounds. So if I search for calendar, I can bring up a calendar. It comes with Fantasy Grounds, nothing special. And then once that happens, now I have an option of different calendars. I can have a standard Gregorian one, or I can have one that's based on the world that I'm in. So there's the Pact Worlds, there's Flanus for Greyhawk, there's Galorian, Galifar, Tyr, Barovia, the calendar of Harptos for the Forgotten Realms, the Third Imperium calendar for Traveler, and Ravnica. So there's a lot of different calendars. You can also make your own calendar, but that takes a lot more understanding of the interface and how Fantasy Grounds works. But once you pick a calendar, you're kind of stuck with it. So I have the standard Gregorian calendar, and I use this to help organize my basically, I can make a journal here. I can set the calendar up and then use it to kind of either in game or out of game, depends on what you want to do. There is no Google integration at this point, so it is internal to Fantasy Grounds, but it is a nice tool. So there's that, and then you have your options menu, which you'll learn how to use that because you can change the way the combat tracker works. You can change movement on the map, how it works. You can change how when players or NPCs, added to the combat tracker, how they'll have the same initiative or random initiatives and different hit points instead of the same hit points. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. And then you have your plus and minus modifiers where you can force an opportunity attack, cover, superior cover, then you have critical damage, max damage, half damage. So you can click on that before you make a roll. That way it'll force the roll if you're not sure if it's going to work right. And you can also make custom modifiers. And then you have your effects area where you can assign torches and stuff to your players. So if I wanted to, let's say this player, I'm going to put him on the map, but I want to give him a name first because that'll confuse Fantasy Grounds. So it's good to have a portrait and a name, is if you put it on the map without a name or a portrait, it really throws it off. So I'm going to grab this player and drag and drop him onto the map, which is one of your first steps. That's a starting location, basically. Once I have him there, and I go into play mode, so if I unlock the map and I go to play mode and I enable the line of sight and the lighting tool, this is what he's going to see, the player. So if I take possession of the token, that's what he's looking at. So here's possession, not possessed. Possession, not possessed. So there's a GM view and then there's a player view. So when I have him actually put on here as a token and I'm watching, when I move this through, it will reveal the shadowed areas. Now, if this was set to dark or like nighttime, I could add a candle or a lamp. So if I grab this lamp or a torch or whatever, so I'm going to grab a candle, drag and drop it onto the player. That adds a candlelight. You can kind of see it there. And when I'm moving this around, it'll illuminate whatever area he's in with the candlelight. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with Fantasy Grounds. You don't have to use this feature, but it is kind of fun because it takes some of the metagaming and some of the mystery and puts it into the game. So there's really a lot of good things about Fantasy Grounds. You just have to realize where they're at. You have all the conditions, so if he was poisoned or frightened, you drag that over there. Fantasy Grounds will automatically apply the penalties or bonuses or the disadvantage or whatever it is associated with that particular condition. You can also make your own conditions. You can make your own presets for lighting. So maybe you have a spell like maybe you want to illuminate somebody with the Fairy Fire spell, so you can make your own spell light in the options area. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with Fantasy Grounds. Just got to know where things are at, get used to the right-click option, and lay out your windows the way you want them. Don't have them all over the place. Like I see people like this, and they got stuff right here, and they go, well, I need to read this. So they'll close that, and then they'll read this, and then they'll move it back over here, and they'll close it. And then the map, they'll sit here and fight with that. So they go, well, it's too small. I can't read it. So they'll bring it out here, and they'll stretch it all the way out here, and then they realize, oh, I need the story entry too. So you bring up this, and then pretty soon it's a mess. So try to put things where you want them to go. And I just kind of showed you a basic layout. You can lay it out any way you want, but make it kind of your de facto way of doing things because it makes things so much easier. and encourage your players to do something similar. So when they have their player character sheet, it's where it's accessible, it's not covering anything, and we had shortcuts that were in the shortcut bar to make it easier for them to navigate. Because most of the time you're on your Actions tab when you're using your weapons and spells, and then you have to go all the way to your skills area to roll a skill. It's better if you have a couple of your main skills bookmarked, and then of course your initiative, but just remember that dice rolls can change, so you might have to update your initiative roll if you go up in level, or your dex increases, or you have a magic item, whatever. You might have to redrag this occasionally to update it, because these shortcuts are static. Once you drag them, they stay that way. They don't level up with your character. So that's all I got. I think that's all the yammering I need to do for right now. Hopefully that helps you guys a little bit with navigating Fantasy Grounds Unity. Pretty much the same kind of thing in any rule set. So if you play Pathfinder or any of the other games or rule sets, they'll be very similar. The titles might be a little different on the right-hand side. There might be a button or two that are different depending on the rule set. But the basic foundation of Fantasy Grounds is your right-click options, laying your windows out where you want them, and becoming familiar with what's in each one of these data types, and then navigating through your library and using that as a tool so you can read your adventure. So if you have your laptop with you and you're sitting up in bed, you can actually bring up your adventure and read the reference manual, which is your book, basically. And then you can go through the chapters, you can bookmark stuff, do research. Like if you wanted to run this Goblin Arrows thing, you can go through here and read this stuff and use this as your guide. But just remember that I have the scale at 80%. So if you change the scaling, it's going to also change how much room you have. So if I do the command of scale UI, which is a /scale UI with a space after it, and it's all one word, scale UI, that's scale user interface, with a space after it, if I click 110, it's going to make it so I can read it better, but I'm not going to have as much room. So just keep that in mind when you're scaling, is you kind of have to, set it to where it's kind of a happy medium. And that's where you're going to have issues with Fantasy Grounds, is when you have it scaled like that, it can really be problematic. So just be careful. If you make it too big, you're not going to have enough room. If you make too much room, you're not going to be able to read the text. So there's a trade-off. And I would say between 80 and 90% is good for that sort of thing. The other thing is unlocking this window and moving it to where you need it to go. And I'm going to go back to my normal scale. Maybe I'll go to 90% or 85. So I'm going to go to scale UI. Now remember, you can change this permanently. This is only for the setting. So scale UI, let's say 85. That's a pretty good number. So then this is where you're going to get a little bit more room, but you're still going to be able to read the text. I had it set at 80. I might leave it at 85. It looks really good. My eyes are old, so. And then I'm going to unlock and remove this, or re-drag it to where I want it. It does lose its location when you scale, so that's a bummer. If you want the dice tower to be visible for you, you go into the options, and you turn on the dice tower for your clients or your players. And if you want to see it as well and use it, you have to click on Show GM Roles On. It'll default on the bottom right. You just unlock it, move it over. I usually park it right here next to the dice, so it's convenient. And anytime you want to do hidden rolls at this point, you have to drag and drop into the dice tower. So that's a setting in Fantasy Grounds. So some rule sets don't use dice tower, so just let you know. Anyways, I think I'll let you go. Have a good week. Happy gaming, everybody, and I will see you around. Join Fantasy Grounds Academy if you are still unsure about Fantasy Grounds and you want to check it out. Give it a try. Also, make sure that you have a good understanding of the platform before you start running it. Maybe run some one-shots, or just kind of get in on some games, or go around and look for, hey, Bane, what's up? Go around and look for people to help you with whatever. And our community is great for that. We're pretty much 24 hours. It gets a little slow at night, but for the most part, we're around to help you guys out if you want. Or you can just come in and absorb the information. You don't have to take any classes. I just wanted to spread the word and get you guys used to the interface. That's the main thing, is to get this information out to you and to help you get used to digesting this powerful tools that you can use to run your games. And remember, a lot of the stuff's universal. So even though I showed you D&D 5e, it applies to 90% of the other content. So keep that in mind. Anyhow, folks, I'm done rambling. Take care. See you around. And don't forget, Halloween next week, I got a couple spots left. So if you want to play in a one-shot and see what Fantasy Grounds like, I think I have 1 or 2 slots left for the 30th, Saturday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. It's on our calendar.